It's interesting how our gospel readings are put together and selected for these first few weeks of Easter. Last week, on the celebration of Easter, the one time when so many people come to Mass, we have a gospel in which Jesus is not present at all. All we have is the empty tomb. Mary Magdalene tells the apostles, and two of them go to see the empty tomb, and that's what we have. This week, however, we have the continuation of John's gospel, and we have a story of the appearances of Jesus. And not just the appearances, but the recognition of Christ. The appearances aren't just simply appearance stories, but how they came to recognize Jesus. And of course, then today, as we always hear every year, the story of Thomas, it ends with the beatitude that Jesus gives to him. Blessed are they who have not seen, yet still believe. And so it got me thinking, who are the ones that Jesus appears to after his resurrection? St. Paul says he was the last of the appearances, and that Jesus appeared to 500 others. We don't know who all those 500 are, but who are those that Jesus appeared to? Well, when you talk to some people in the Catholic Church, it's a rather grand tradition that's even in writing by St. Ignatius of Loyola. It's a reflection he has during his 30 days. Many would say, of course, the very first person Jesus would have appeared to after the resurrection is his mother, Mary. It's understandable, and perhaps an appropriate reflection for a parish such as St. Bruno's, who a few years ago was actually consecrated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And many people have a devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And they would say, well, of course, she's his mother. Who else would he appear to first? It's interesting, though, on a bit of a side note, if I were to ask some people when Jesus died and descended among the dead, who was the first person he looked for, they all look very lost. Abraham? No, come on, think, folks. Isaiah? No, come on, think. Who would? John the Baptist? No. Okay, his mother would be the first one after he rises from the dead. When he goes among the dead, who's the first one he's going to look for? Folks, he did have a dad, you know. Would he perhaps look for Joseph? And sometimes we often think of Mary and we often forget that she was a married woman and a widow. But when we look in the Scriptures, however, it's interesting. Nowhere in the Scriptures is there any telling of any story of Jesus appearing to his mother, which is unusual, considering especially two of them have a tradition of perhaps being close to her. Luke, who tells the infancy narrative of the Annunciation, the visitation, the finding of Jesus in the temple, the presentation, and so on. Mary disappears shortly after the infancy narratives. After the finding of the temple, we don't see her at all, really, in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of John, presumably this is the disciple who took her into his home, and yet he tells no story of the mother of Jesus, who gets as far as the cross in the story of John's Gospel, yet there's no story of Jesus appearing to his mother. So every now and again, people might ask me the question, well, did Jesus appear to his mother after the resurrection? And folks, you know me, I always answer those questions the same way. I don't know, I wasn't there. But when you look at what the stories are in the Scriptures, who does in fact Jesus appear to? And what does it entail? Well, in the Gospel of Luke, he first appears to the men on the road to Emmaus, a very well-known, very popular story. But they don't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. And later they say they came to know him, not in the man on the road, not in the man sitting there in front of them, but in the breaking of the bread. We have that encounter whenever we come to celebrate the Mass. But in the midst of that, what does Jesus say to these crestfallen men? He says to them, how slow you are to understand. When he appears to the apostles, even at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, when he gives them the Great Commission, it says they saw him, but some still doubted. And Jesus reprimanded them for their lack of faith. But in 3 out of the 4 Gospels, who is it that Jesus appears to first? At least as is told in the Gospels. In the Gospel of Mark, it's a group of women as they're leaving the tomb, one of whom is Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's no group of women. Mary is going away from the tomb, and Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel of John, who is the first one Jesus appears to? Mary Magdalene. Not the Mary who's an image of purity and holiness, but a Mary who is an image of holiness brought forth from conversion. She's the one out of whom 7 demons had been expelled. And even in the Gospel of John, Mary did not recognize him until he addressed her by name. It wasn't Mary, his mother, but Mary Magdalene that the Gospels relate as the first one Jesus appeared to. What do we make of that? It's interesting, because we are obviously people with a strong devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And granted, we don't have it in the Gospel stories themselves. We like to insert the story, and even St. Ignatius of Loyola leads a reflection in his exercises on picturing Jesus appearing to his mother, but it perhaps would bear the question. All of these people that Jesus appeared to, one way or another, were reprimanded. Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him until he addressed her by name, or, in another sense, she has 7 demons that had been expelled from her. Peter had denied him 3 times. Thomas doubted him. The apostles were afraid, and Jesus appeared to them and gave them that strength. When we think of the faith of the Blessed Virgin Mary that we honor and we seek to emulate, did she really need Jesus to appear to her? After all, what does Jesus say in today's Gospel? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. We like to apply that line to ourselves because, of course, we have not seen Jesus as the apostles did. But are we that reluctant to apply it to the Blessed Virgin Mary? Jesus aims other beatitudes at her. Earlier, they say, your mother is outside and wants to see you. And he says, well, my mother and my brothers and sisters are those who hear the word of God and keep it, which we know Mary did. In the Gospel of Luke, a woman comes up to Jesus and says, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you. In other words, blessed is your mother. And Jesus actually contradicts that. He doesn't say also, he says, rather, blessed is the one who hears the word of God and keeps it, which we know Mary did perfectly. The prototype of discipleship. But here Jesus says, blessed are they who have not seen and still believe. Do we perhaps have someone else in mind? Perhaps Mary heard about it from Mary Magdalene, who was shocked that Jesus hadn't appeared to her. Perhaps she heard it from St. Peter, who was surprised that of all people he would have seen Jesus, but his mother, perhaps not. Perhaps she heard it from St. Thomas himself. Did he? I don't know. I wasn't there. But he would be surprised that he who doubted had the privilege of seeing Jesus until he remembered what Jesus said to him. Blessed are those who have not seen and still believe. It's the faith we profess of the Jesus we encounter here in the breaking of the bread, but who we have not seen in the glorified form that we hear in the gospel such as today. So who knows what Mary's response might have been when Thomas or Mary or Peter or anyone said, Jesus rose from the dead. Would it have been simply, he did? Would it have been, I know, I saw him? Or would it have been simply, of course he did?